Okay, can you hear and see me? I cannot hear anything. Are you hearing me? Okay, I'm not hearing anything. Let's see. I've got sound on, so I don't know why I'm not hearing. Let's see.
Hold on.
Ah, I'm hearing something.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. You want to do a cell phone commercial?
And we got a few other people joining.
Okay.
I see Carl.
Okay.
And he should be unmuted.
Hi guys. Hi John.
Hey Carl, how you doing?
No complaints.
Good.
That's a nice bet. That's a nice Louisville you have in the corner there.
Yep. From the Hartford Current. That was given to, I forgot why, but I know I had it when I left. So
that's a good one. Got your Yankee cap too, I see.
Yeah. It's always a good oh, there we go. Different view of everything. It's always a good conversation piece. The glove that's up there, a friend of mine in Washington said, "Hey, I got a present for you." And he sent me a glove that he had that's a Yogi Berra model glove, so it's a lot smaller than the ones today, and it's signed by Berra. So he made it. He sent me a gift, which was really nice, and obviously the rest is all Yogi. So
very cool.
How are things in Connecticut?
They're good. I'm still in touch with a few people from the current. Bruce Burlett.
How is Bruce doing? God, I haven't heard his name in a long, long time.
I think he's doing great. He came actually when Jeff Otterbein retired. We did a SABR panel in his honor, and Jack from the Hall of Fame came up from New York.
Okay.
What's Jack's
O'Connell.
last name?
O'Connell. Jackie O'Connell.
Yep. And John Altavilla, who I think came after you, after you.
Yeah, he came. He was in New Haven when I was there.
Yep. Let's see. And Bruce and somebody. Oh, you know what? I think I'm confusing Bruce with Tommy Hine.
Tommy. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Good guys. All of them good guys.
Yep. Well, I still talk to online Scott Power, who I hired and left, I don't know, 12 weeks later. And somehow we've become fast friends. We just bonded those 12 weeks, I guess. And I talk to Ken Davis from time to time. And of course I talk to my best friend Claire a lot. And she's still at ESPN and living out there in, I guess, Ellington. And I think that's about it. And every so often I get an email from Dennis Horgan, and I've seen Marty Petty's name a couple of times pass through. But that's, and I guess there was Lori Riley sent me. I mean, she did a story on Claire, so she interviewed me a year or two ago. But I guess there was a whole thing about basically Save the Hartford Current thing that went around about, 3-4 weeks ago or longer? Yeah. The weeks are all blend now.
Yeah, I think part of it might be a plea to please have somebody buy the Current who cares about journalism.
Yeah.
Yeah, and separate it from whatever it is now, Tronc or whatever it is.
Whatever it is. It's, God, I mean, I grew up reading Newsday. And it was a great newspaper, and I came here, pretty much at the end of newspapering, as we knew it. And now I don't even know who owns it. I never read it. I don't know who gets it anymore. And this was the third or fourth largest paper in the country. So yeah, those were the good old days.
So John, what newspapers do you read regularly now?
the Washington Post and the New York Times. Those are the two basic ones, and lots of. I mean, I spend more time on Twitter than I'd like to think.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, and it used to be Facebook, but I hate Mark Zuckerman, and his refusal to be at all responsible with the platform that he owns. But Twitter isn't. I mean, for one thing, just about every author tries to develop a Twitter audience. All the sports people and all the politicians are on Twitter. So, and there's, it's kind of the Wild West, and there's an awful lot to read on there. So it ends up being a good chunk of what I end up reading. I mean, lots of the links are to the Washington Post, the LA Times, the Wall Street Journal, those places.
I tell you, these digital subscriptions are fantastic, where you can go and read the Post every day and the Times every day.
Yeah.
So affordable. And
I know. I got to say, though, it does hurt to see newspapers begging, saying, hey, for $1, you can get a subscription for 6 months for $1.
Yep.
And it's like, God, I just remember when, newspapers were real, and it kind of hurts. And now, who knows? I mean, this whole I've been doing books now. This is the second one. I've been doing this for 10 years, and the book industry is as big a mess as magazines and newspapers are.
Yeah.
John, welcome. This is Steve here.
Hey, Steve, how you doing?
Okay, how are you? Wanted to welcome you, and I'm going to be asking you a number of questions about your book, because that's evidently the format that you wanted.
And that's a little bit in deference to Yogi, because Yogi would never accept a speaking engagement other than Q&A. He was the most asked for speaker during his entire time with the Yankees, and he never did anything but Q&A. And I think that probably stemmed from the original Yogiism from Yogi Night at Sportsman Park, when he said, thanked everyone for making this night necessary.
Yes, that's a famous one.
And that was the first. And after that, he just, it's like, in fact, there was a newspaper guy named Burns, I'm blanking on his first name, but he used to go with him to a lot of especially in St. Louis, to a lot of the speaking engagements. And basically, he would just ask the questions and then turn it over to the audience. And, that was the hour with Yogi.
Good. Have you been introduced to all these fine folks?
Carl, I know.
Okay.
Your engineer, we were talking, but I'm sorry, but I didn't catch your name, and your name is not in the box. So that's
Oh, it isn't.
No. Alan's name is in the box. That is very helpful.
I'm Saber.
How you doing? Oh,
good. Good. How you doing?
okay.
And Tom Manito over there with the headphones is running the Zoom. So
Okay, great.
So I think we should
all
have a
I'm
good
doing is
event.
admitting people, and then it's Steve, you're introducing, and it's all your show. And
Okay.
what I'll do is, after, I think you gave him 20 minutes to talk, and then a Q&A. So I may say something when you're getting close. That's all.
Okay,
Well,
Steve.
that's a good
Steve,
idea.
tilt your computer a little bit down so we can see your whole face.
Yeah, that would be.
Okay.
There you go.
One of my many vintage baseball hats. Down there is Tom Zacco, our ultimate Dodger fan.
Hey, Tom, how you doing?
Hey, how you doing?
Good, good.
And he's
Good to
got
see
the
you.
Library of Zoc back there, as it's called.
Okay.
So, now,
Now, does the background, the lighting is good? You guys can see well enough?
No, you're back. The lighting is very good.
Yes,
Good.
perfect.
I think, after several missteps, my wife took over. And she said, let me do this. This doesn't look good. So the wife took it, and now that's why I'm sitting where I'm sitting. The office is kind of twisted around to make it work, but as long as it works, that's good.
And looks like Paul Hensler's coming on, who's another one of our authors, and he'll he'll speak at the
Eric's
after
coming up.
Alan about something he's doing.
Yeah.
Special.
Good evening, gentlemen.
Paul, how are you?
Hi, Carl.
I can
Mr.
hear you, but I
Pessah,
can't
good-
see you. Oh,
Just, Paul, just check the video thing on your thing.
We are all getting used to life with Zoom.
Yeah.
You're right.
You know, when I first started doing these, it's like, this is just so weird. But now this is what we do. I mean, this is how we talk. This is how I talk to my family now.
This is the
Wow,
fourth Zoom meeting I've
interesting.
had this week, and it's
Yeah,
Wednesday.
exactly. You
Yeah.
know, I talked to my 90-year-old mother-in-law on Zoom. You know, so
wow.
I once had 4 Zoom sessions in one day, and that's probably not even the record.
yeah, that's enough though.
Little bit much. Paul, how you doing there?
Good, Steve. You like my
Good.
video? Or you want me to shut it off again? I look better with it off.
You look fine, Paul.
Thanks.
And let's say hello to Erik Sherman. Welcome to the show, as we'd say.
No, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. Can you hear me?
Good.
Okay,
Oh, you're fine.
You're fine.
okay,
Hey,
great.
Steve, I
Okay.
did make a setting on, change the setting on Zoom where it was defaulted. Everybody who comes in is muted and can't unmute themselves. I'm letting people unmute themselves.
Yeah.
So they can just.
Probably
Free for all. All right.
Probably a good idea.
I figure we're all grown-ups and hopefully we just.
Yes. That's good. So basically what'll happen is that when we're ready to start, that Tom will say a couple of things because he's our
I'll just
tech-
go over the ground rules.
Yes, and that's good. And then I'll greet people, and then we'll start with John, and then we'll go to you, Erik.
Great.
Alan, and then Alan's got a few things to bring up, and then Paul will finish. And if there's any announcements, future plans or other things, then we'll do that.
Sounds good.
So Tom, your Dodgers are looking good.
I'm not a.
They are,
Dodger
but I'm
fan.
not that excited this year with this
Oh.
universal DH and seven inning double headers and running around second and 10 innings. It's a lost season to me.
It is a very strange season, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, I turn on a Yankee game and they're losing by a couple of runs. It's the 7th inning, and I'm going, all right, they got a couple of innings, you know, they got some guys coming up. And of course, it was the second game of a doubleheader. And it's like, no,
Right.
the game's over. I mean, what do you
Yeah.
mean it's over?
Mhm.
I just, you know, the whole thing just feels, I mean, with a guy on, like you said, a guy on second and extra innings, every inning,
Well-
the Yankees, I think, played 11 the other day. So
Yeah.
there kept being a guy on second base. It's like, okay, this, you know, one inning I can take of that, but every inning is like, this is just really feels weird, especially when Gary Sanchez is catching, because that's almost like a guy on third. And
Yeah, unfortunately.
What was the game
Yeah.
a couple of
We,
weeks ago? They had.
I got used to all of that, working double-A ball up here in Hartford with the guy on second and extra innings and the 7-inning games, of course,
right.
in double headers. I don't know what other crazy things are going to be going on.
I don't know. The sound kind of drives me crazy. I mean, the sound, you know, the dissonance of hearing the sound and looking at the TV and seeing nobody in the stands.
Yeah, yeah.
That is weird. It's just weird. Michael K said the other day going, well, the fake fans are really getting charged up now. The Yankees are rallying.
Right.
And it's like, all right, it just, you know, the whole thing just feels very strange. And the playoffs are next week. And it, you know, I'm a little surprised we got this far, quite frankly. You know, I had my doubts, but you know, whoever wins, it just, you know, it's going to be COVID 2020. You know, just put it all in a box and let's just dump it in the ocean somewhere.
Yeah. I know there's different opinions about the rule changes and all that, but I have to say that I was at least happy to have something to watch.
But,
No,
yes, I'll agree with that.
you could argue it's tainted and all that, but there was really nothing to watch sports-wise prior to all this?
No, there was absolutely no diversion. And I'm 68 years old, and ever since I was 4 years old, starting in April, starting in February, the games were on, and the games were always on, until the last game of the season. There was always a game on the TV, on the radio, now on the internet. It was always on. So there's an unbelievable void that it was like, I didn't realize just how much I was going to miss it. I mean, I like every other sport, but baseball's baseball. I mean, it's just part of my growing up, and who I
Amen
am.
to that. In fact, related to that, John, I read something not that long ago that somebody asked Rogers Hornsby, how did he get through the winter? And he said something to the effect, I'm going to paraphrase this, something about, I'm just sort of sit at the window and stare and wait for baseball to That's probably not exactly what he said, but something in that ballpark, if you don't.
It was just like wait for spring.
Waited for the snow to go away, I think is what he said.
Oh, okay. Thanks for correcting me. So now we got Joe Williams. Welcome, Joe. And who else do we have?
Jennifer?
That's Mark. That's Mark Wise. Jennifer's Mark
Oh,
Wise.
that's right.
Oh, okay. Mark, welcome.
And I don't know who iPhone is.
Nah.
And 337-359.
By the way, Steve, feel free to go off script. Ask me anything you want about Yogi. I don't, Carl asked me to send some questions, but you can ask anything you're curious about.
John,
I do.
I assume you've been to the Yogi Museum a couple of times?
Many times. Great little place. Really a cool little place to go to.
Good. I do have a long list of questions, but I might abbreviate it because of, we've got a lot of really knowledgeable people here in our SABR chapter.
Right.
And, we named it for Smoky Joe Wood because some of us got to know Bob Wood, his son, who was a good friend of the chapter. So therefore, we named the chapter for his son, Smoky Joe
cool.
Wood, who had some big seasons with the Red Sox, as our Red Sox fans here, like Mark, can attest to. So,
Well, I won't hold being a Red Sox fan against anybody. So,
well, I would like to jump in and piggyback on that statement about Smoky Joe Wood. When I was 14 years old, I had the idea of sending index cards to the Hall of Famers, to their homes back before the memorabilia craze got.
Yeah, I did the same thing in spring training.
Yeah, so there was actually a book put out by Smalling, and I think it still exists, and they updated, and so I sent a letter to Smoky Joe Wood, and I asked him to sign an index card and to put his autograph, 1912 championship Red Sox, and his number that he wore. So he wrote back to me. This is the letter. And he wrote, he said, I don't think we wore numbers in those days. And
oh, that's cool. Oh my God. How cool is that?
Nice.
That's great.
So it says, I love it. To Eric, with best wishes, 1912 championship Red Sox, Joe Wood.
Joe Wood.
Nice.
That's tremendous.
Yeah.
That's Eric, that's a collector's item. Hold on to that.
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, what I did, aside from Smoky Joe Wood, I mean, I got index cards and letters back from Ted Williams, Joe DiMaggio.
Nice.
Really?
So that's how I spent the summer of 1980. And it was like my birthday every single day when the mail truck would pull up. And it was exciting because I didn't know who I might get. So it was fun. You'd send a self-addressed envelope out to the players. And so it was always in my writing, but I didn't know until I opened it who it was from. So it was kind of a neat thing.
I used to do that in spring training in the 60s. I got Roberto Clemente sent me a card, autographed, postcard
Wow.
of himself.
Wow.
I got Ken Boyer, I got Whitey, Mickey, and I got a letter from Al Downing, who the first season looked like he was going to be a Hall of Famer, and I wrote him after that and told him so, and he wrote back and thanked me for saying such nice things about him, and very nice handwriting on Yankee Clipper stationery.
Oh, that's great.
And wrote my brother a similar letter, because my brother also wrote to him. And I spent many hours with Al on this book, and just the nicest guy. One of the really interesting things about doing this book was talking to the people who I grew up watching. And any Yankee fan, I'm 68, any Yankee fan my age, Ralph Terry was a dirty word in our house. The ball, giving up the home run to Mazeroski. And I called him the nicest guy. And we spent a day together in New York when he came in for a old timers game. And he was just a sweetheart. And it's like my whole 40 years or more than that of thinking about a man completely changed in an afternoon. Very nice guy.
Hey, Steve, it's almost 7:05. Do we want to get started?
Yes, I would say let's do that. I would add a brief footnote to what John said. I never got over that home run in 1960. That one of the worst parts of my childhood, because I'm about your age.
It was scarring.
I know.
It really was.
Well, I agree.
Tommy,
Started
I have a hang on a sec.
Oh, please go ahead.
Thanks. Hey, Tom, Ray Secor is asking if you would please unmute him.
Oh, sure. He should be able to unmute himself.
He may not know how to do it.
Okay,
and we have 3 people on who haven't done the video yet, and it would be good to see Joe Williams and the other 2 people. Just go to the upper left-hand corner of your screen and try to get the video. There we go. There's Stan.
Stan the
I don't know
man.
if the other 2 will be able to do it or not.
Oh, wow.
And,
all right. So now I got gallery view, so I'm seeing most everyone here.
Yep. And if you
So I want to welcome everybody to our meeting. So let's get started. And Tom, you've got a few things to mention before we get moving here.
just a few ground rules. I'm not going to unmute anybody, but I do ask if there's any background noise that if you please mute yourself, have some, just show the speakers a little respect there. And also remember, we can see you on video, so watch what you're doing.
Yeah.
I've been on a few Zoom calls that
yeah.
But
Good safety tip.
Yeah, other than that, I mean, if you have questions, I'm sure the speakers would love to hear them. So, Steve, I'll let you get going.
All right, Tom, thank you very much. That with his help and with the help of our other leadership, that we got this Zoom going. So welcome everybody to our SABR virtual meeting. And today is a famous day in baseball history. Hank Aaron's home run in the 11th inning against the Cardinals in '57 clinched the pennant for the Braves, who beat, well, I'll say my Yankees. I can't speak for everyone here because there's lots of different teams, but you don't forget about stuff like that. So the batting order is, we're going to start with Jon Pessah. I've got a number of questions. I'm not going to ask all of them. So you'll have about half an hour, including Q&A. And then we shift gears to Erik Sherman, who is also an author. And we'll hear about what your writings about the Mets and Red Sox. And about a half an hour for you. Then Alan Cohen's got a few things to bring up about his projects. And then we'll close with Paul Hensler, who's also working on a couple of interesting things too. So So let's get started. So, John, you've got a book about Yogi. I see it in the background. You might want to tell us later how we can get it. And so I guess among the questions I'll want to ask you to kick off our discussion tonight would be, of all the players to spend 4 years of your life reporting and writing about, why Yogi? Not that it's a bad choice, but tell us about that, please.
Sure. Starts with he was my father's favorite player. And so my father was a catcher. I became a catcher. Yogi became one of my favorite players, even though my first memories of Yogi is 59-60, where he's pretty much now a good role-playing outfielder for the Yankees. And I've been in this business a long time, and the longer, Yogi, the longer the legend was around, the more it felt like his persona, his outsized persona, overshadowed what was a tremendous career, and really overshadowed who the man really was. And I knew him some, and a few of my friends knew him really well. And I just thought he would be just a fascinating subject to dive into. And I found out more things than I had room for, because the book ran 506 pages, and I cut 60 pages out of it before I turned it into the publisher.
Well, thank you. So related to that, with Yogi having been brought up in St. Louis, as was also Elston Howard, how did he become a Yankee, and how did he get his nickname of Yogi?
Okay, interrelated. How he becomes a Yankee, Red Shandings told me a terrific story. Back in those days, this is 1941, there used to be ads in papers that said open tryout for the St. Louis Cardinals, come to Sportsman's Park. And, hundreds of kids would show up. In this particular time, thousands of kids showed up. Took 2 days. They got it down to 8 kids. And Red remembered that it was him. It was Yogi, then Larry Berra, because he wasn't Yogi yet, or Lordy, as his mother called him, because she couldn't pronounce Lawrence. And Joe Garagiola, Yogi's across the street neighbor and best friend, and then 5 people he didn't know. And they just auditioned for Ricky and the Scouts. And Ricky is supposed to be the greatest talent scout in the history of the game, the father of the minor farm system. And Red said it fell to him to pitch to Yogi. And he was a couple of years old. He was 18, Yogi was 16. And he said, I had a really good arm, and I was a pretty fair pitcher, and I could not get a single pitch past this kid. And the sound of the ball hitting the bat was just so incredible that he said, I've never forgotten it. Said he's just the best hitter that he ever saw, and was convinced that Ricky was going to sign him. Ricky liked Joe Garagiola better, and told Yogi that he thought, to his face, he said, son, I'm telling you this for your own good. I think you're a AAA baseball player at best. And we want players who can go all the way. And so the Cardinals pass on him. Yogi plays American Legion ball for 2 years in St. Louis. And after the second year, the head of the program knew the general manager of Yankees, George Weiss, sent him a telegram and said, I got a kid who does everything wrong, and everything comes out right. All it'll cost you is a $500 bonus, and he's yours. And the 42 World Series was the Yankees Cardinals. Yankees lost. There was a coach from New York, from St. Louis. Weiss said, check this out. He checked him out. Everyone said, this guy is the best kid we've ever seen. And Weiss gave him the $500, and Yogi Berra is a New York Yankee and not a St. Louis Cardinal. And also to the people who, like my brother-in-law, who are Baltimore Oriole fans, the St. Louis Browns, in their great wisdom, figured, well, if Yogi, if Brent Rickey didn't want Yogi Berra, then we don't want him either. So they passed on Yogi Berra without even giving him a tryout. And of course, 1954, they become the Baltimore Orioles, and Yogi is in the second of his 3 MVP seasons. So the Baltimore Orioles would have had Yogi Berra in his prime as their catcher.
John, I have a question for you.
Sure.
There is a story that I have heard that Ricky didn't sign Berra
Trying to hide him, right?
because he wanted to sign him when Ricky got to the Dodgers. And in the interim, of course, the Yankees did sign Berra.
Right. The only problem with that story is that when he passed on Yogi, 1941, America's not in the war. The only reason the Dodgers needed a general manager was because, and I'm blanking on the famous, Larry McPhail, went back to the Army. And who knew America was going to be in the war? Who knew that McPhail was going to join the Army? Therefore, there would be an opening. So to think 3 steps down that, okay, all these things were going to happen, and so I'm going to hide Yogi here. That's a real stretch. I think why that comes about is, it's now 1943, and Yogi is literally packing to go to the minor leagues to report to Norfolk. And a day or two before he leaves, he gets a telegram from the Dodgers that asks him to report to their minor league training camp, the major league training camp in Bear Mountain, New York. And it was Branch Rickey who sent the telegram. Of course, there weren't a whole lot of ball players. People signed up for World War II in a rush. And, the major leagues were depleted of players. So I think that Rickey was looking for, there was this kid that was okay. He was only a AAA baseball player, but now AAA is making the major leagues. So let me sign him. So I think that's where that legend comes from.
Okay. Thank you. A few more things in terms of questions. You write a lot about the discrimination and the verbal abuse that Yogi endured throughout his career. Can you talk about, please, when that started and how he dealt with it?
Sure. I tell you what, I was really surprised to see both of those to the depth that they existed. One, I didn't know that the discrimination against Italian Americans in the 30s, 40s, and 50s was what it was. I mean, everyone knows there were the Japanese internment camps, but during World War II, but the same thing existed for Italians. In fact, Yogi came from a place called The Hill in St. Louis, and everybody's home was searched by the FBI to find sympathizers for the Italians in the war. His first year in the minor leagues, a guy named Shecky Kane is his manager, and it's in the Piedmont League. In the minor leagues, basically the fans are almost on the field, so that everything the fans are saying, the players can hear, and they are just all over Yogi for being Italian, for the odd way that he looks. And of course, he's hitting the heck out of the ball, and he's just getting madder and madder. And Kane said to him, listen, you're going to get a lot of abuse, especially because you're an Italian. And if you let people see that it's getting to you, then you're going to hear it for the rest of your life. Just ignore it. And that's how Yogi dealt with it. And when he ended up getting to the major leagues, the fans, the players, the media, opposing players would mock him for his looks. He was called, his first manager, Bucky Harris, used to call him the Ape. He was called Quasimodo. He was called Nature Boy. Was the headline of a column in the New York Times on Yogi Berra from Pulitzer Prize winning columnist Arthur Daly. He was called the ugliest man in baseball. He was mocked for his supposed lack of intelligence, to the point where Carmen, his wife, who really was upset about all of this, really never wanted him to be a manager for just that reason, because she knew that he was going to end up hearing all over again what he heard during his career was about how supposedly he wasn't very bright, which, by the way, was anything but true. And, so basically he dealt with it stoically. And one of the things I thought was remarkable about him was, that can go two ways. I mean, you get beat up like that for your whole career. They used to throw bananas out there at home plate when Yogi, caught and when he came up to play. And you can either end up, taking it in stride, laughing it off, or you can end up bitter. And Yogi is a guy who just, it hurt him, no question about it. The first 2 paragraphs of his autobiography in 1961 is about the 2 Yogis, the caricature guy and the one who really exists. So clearly it made a mark on him, but he was able to still look at people as if, and treat everybody the same way that he wanted to be treated himself.
That's good. Thank you. And now, I think one of the more important questions to be asked, among other things, was that despite becoming a Hall of Famer, you've written that Yogi was underrated. Could you tell us why you feel that way?
Sure. I got to tell you, going in, I mean, I'm 68 years old. I grew up watching Mickey Mantle. I look at the Mount Rushmore of Yankees, and it's Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Joe DiMaggio, Mickey Mantle. When I finished this book, I thought that it was Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Joe DiMaggio, and Yogi Berra. And Yogi Berra was the best player on the best team in baseball history, the only team to win 5 straight World Series. From 1949 to 1953, he was the guy. 25 to 30 home runs, which in those days was a lot of home runs, 100 RBIs, 280 to 320 batting average, averaged about 14 strikeouts a year, caught an average of 141 games, was an exceptional defensive catcher, the most important position on the field. And, the last couple of years of DiMaggio's career, he played half a season when he was hurt. The last year, he batted .263 and clearly wasn't Joe DiMaggio. This overlapped with the beginning of Mickey Mantle's career, and Mantle was, struck out as often as he hit. Yogi was the guy, and I don't think people realize what an unbelievable impact for a 7-year stretch, 3 MVPs, 2 seconds, a third, and the fourth. I just don't think that when people think Yogi Berra, I think when people think Yogi Berra, they think about Yogiisms first. And then, the commercials second, and his baseball career third. So that's why I think he's, completely underrated.
Well, thank you. And I was always a big Mickey guy, but I can see your point about Yogi. I missed that 5 in a row stretch. I don't know if anyone on this call saw that, but I don't think you'll ever see anything like that again.
Agreed.
One more thing before we open it up to everybody.
Sure.
Why did the Yankees fire Berra as manager after the '64 season?
2 words, Ralph Houck, who was supposed to be his mentor and instead undermined Yogi. I don't know how many people know the phrase, the milkshake rebellion, but there was an awful lot of players who Houck groomed as he was coming up through the minor leagues, who weren't thrilled with the way Yogi was managing them, didn't like the fact that he let Whitey and Mickey basically set their own rules, which he did until mid-August, and just kept going behind Yogi's back, complaining to Ralph Houck. And if anyone should understand the chain of command, it was a guy who became a major during World War II, and should have told the players to turn around and go back and talk to Yogi if you've got problems. And certainly he ought to have talked to Yogi about it. The only people he talked about it to were the 2 owners who he told by late July that, we got to get rid of Yogi. This was a mistake. And by the end of the season, that mistake ends up taking a team that we all now know was getting broken down, old, and injury prone, to within 3 runs of winning the World Championship against a very, very good St. Louis Cardinal team. So, it would have been interesting. They had made the decision by August 13th, which was before the Phil Linz episode. They had already made the decision they were going to replace him. They didn't think they were going to make it to the World Series. So they decided to do it after the season. It would have been really interesting to find out if he had won the World Series, whether they would have had the guts to pull the trigger on that.
If I may, before I open this up, I remember that 7th game very well. And in today's game, I think that the Cardinal manager would have pulled Gibson because he was clearly tiring, because he gave up 2 home runs in the top of the 9th. Richardson's coming up with Mantle and Maris on deck. And if Richardson had gotten on, I can imagine the Cardinal manager going out there and Gibson saying, "Get out of here," because
Right.
those days they finished what they started. I don't know if you might want to comment, or any of the other people here might want to comment on.
Well, Gibson wasn't coming out. I mean, that was, it was his game, and he was clearly hurting. They could hear him grunting, and it was all just fastball, fastball, fastball. They knew it was coming. And yeah, he did. He got hit, for a couple of home runs, but he was an exceptional pitcher, and he had enough to get him just over the over the finish line.
That's a good point. All right, let's open this up for questions from all of you. So it looks like Carl.
Yeah, I just have a quick mention and then a question. I wanted just to call everybody's attention to an email that I sent out to all of our chapter on Monday, the 21st in the morning. And it said, Yogi, a life behind the mask. And there was a link on that email. If you would like an autographed copy of this book signed by Jon, just go ahead and use that link. Dig out that email. If you don't have the email, if it's discarded or you didn't get it, just reach out to me. But there's a way to do that. And the book is also available on Amazon and probably a lot of other places and without Jon's autograph. But that option is there for you.
Appreciate it.
Hey, Jon, I really appreciated the look into Yogi's upbringing and the insulated life, the protective life that Italian immigrants were living in St. Louis at the time that Yogi came up. Yeah, I saw that before in a Roger Kahn book about DiMaggio, same kind of like culture. It's kind of amazing. How did you draw on all of that to get his upbringing?
Well, I'll tell you what, I got really lucky that sadly Yogi passed about 5 months after I started the book. And I found a bunch of names in some of the obits from people from the Hill who were his age and grew up with him. And, there were one or two comments from them. And there's something, the Hill is still the Hill, basically Little Italy of St. Louis, is still Little Italy of St. Louis. There's hardly anybody there who is not Italian. And there's a neighborhood association, and I called them and I said, do you know these people? Yes, we know them very well. Can you get them for me? Yes, we can. So they got them, and they said, you know what? They said, sure, they'd be happy to meet with you, but they told everything they knew to the newspapers. And I said, don't worry, just have them there at 1 o'clock. I'll bring a box of cookies, put up my iPhone to videotape them. We sat down, three guys, all 90 years old, and they started talking. And 4 hours later, they were still talking about what it was like to grow up in the Depression, on the Hill, the fathers, working in the mines and in the clay factories, the unbelievable number of kids that they all grew up with, how Yogi was the best player at every single sport that they played, how they never ventured out of their community, and certainly not alone, because if they wandered into the German neighborhood, there would be a big fight. Or if they wandered into the Dogtown, which was the Italian neighborhood, the Irish neighborhood, there would be a big fight. It was a much different era, and they loved growing up where they grew up, and they still live there. Well, sadly, 2 of them have now passed. One of them still remains. But people like that, people like Carmen's sister, Carmen being his wife of 65 years, she grew up in the Ozarks, 100 some odd miles out of St. Louis, and her sister moved to the city, and her sister knew Yogi from 1947 and knew St. Louis inside and out, and still lives there and is 91, 92 now. And she has an unbelievably great memory. So it's people like that who were really filled in the blanks on what it was like in the early going.
Thank you.
Jon, thank you.
Sure.
That's good.
Steve, I have just a quick message for Tom.
Oh,
Tommy,
please.
Joe Rundy is asking to be unmuted because he has a question. So I don't know if you can help him, but.
I see Raymond. Ray has a question.
Yeah, I got a question. Could you talk a little bit about, hi, Jon, could you talk a little bit about, good, how are you?
Good.
Could you talk a little bit about Yogi Berra, then going on to manage the Mets for a few years, and then actually coming back to the Yankees and managing in the mid-'80s for a couple of years?
Sure. So he goes to, I mean, he was stunned, utterly stunned to be fired. He thought he was going to get a 2-year contract. He had only asked for a 1-year contract in 63 when they made a deal that no one knew about that for him to manage in 64. He only wanted 1 year because he wanted to see if he liked it and if he was good at it. So he walked in thinking he was going to get a 2-year deal, and he was utterly stunned.
Well, if I can interrupt for just a quick second, wasn't he replaced by Johnny Keane?
And then was
Yeah.
replaced
by the winning manager of who he faced? That would be just
in a
appalling.
deal that was already done before the World Series.
Wow. Okay.
And Johnny Keane also was on his way out. He was in 6th place, and the day that after they won, when August Busch was they were sitting there, he pulled the Belichick, where there was a press conference to announce that Johnny Keane is signing a contract, and Johnny Keane handed the owner his letter of resignation and walked off the stage. And
Wow.
so Yogi was going to get, they said, they knew enough not to sever their ties with Yogi, even if they were going to fire him. They wanted him around. So, or certainly wanted him to leave on his own accord. So he got $25,000 to stay with the Yankees for as long as he wanted to. And that lasted about a month and a half until Casey and George Weiss signed him to be a coach. He got passed over for Wes Westrom, and then he got passed over for Gil Hodges, who he knew very well. They were friends from their days playing all those World Series in Brooklyn against the Yankees. And he actually walked in and told Hodges, listen, if you want all your own guys, that's fine. I'll just leave. And Hodges said, no, I really want you here. So he stayed there. And then Hodges, sadly passed away of a sudden heart attack. And the Mets turned to Yogi, who had managerial experience. Unfortunately, announced it literally the day of Hodges' funeral, which I still to this day can't understand why they did that. And Yogi, gets the kind of backing from Bob Sheffing, who I remember from the Tigers as a GM. He gets the backing from Sheffing that he never got from Houck. They have a couple of 2 fairly good years, and then there's everybody is stacked up in 73, and Mets are in 6th place, but they're never more than about 4 or 5 games behind. And that's when he utters, the famous, it ain't over until it's over. And, Yogi looked at managing like it was a marathon, unlike George Steinbrenner, who thought it was a sprint, like football with, 16 games. And Yogi was the kind of manager who believed my job is to have everyone in a good frame of mind to play, make out the lineup card, let him play. And he was always in there encouraging people. And, after a 162 game season, it worked out pretty well. He won 2 championships. He was the first manager to ever win a pennant in both leagues. He's up 3-2 with the Mets, with against the A's, who were in the middle of their 3 World Series run. He turns to Tom Seaver and says, can you go on 3 days rest? Seaver's the best pitcher in baseball. Seaver says, sure, give me the ball. Something all Met fans still resent about Yogi. Gave him the ball. They lose 3-1. Matlack pitched the next game, lost 4-2 on 2 home runs. And Yogi loses that chance to win the World Series, gets a very nice contract after that. It runs its course. He has some problems with, the run-in with Cleon Jones, which I hope most people know about because it's really too detailed to kind of get into right now. But, he had some problems, and the Mets are up 5 games above 500 when they fire him, and he leaves, and he knew that the Yankees were going to hire him, which they did. And he goes back to manage with Billy, and he was never considered this is when Steinbrenner was at his absolute worst, and I was sports editor of the Hartford Courant, and I had trouble getting people to cover the Yankees. Steve, you mentioned Jackie O'Connell earlier today. He was working for the Daily News covering the Mets, and he wanted to cover the Yankees for me. and he was driving up the turnpike to take the job. And George that day fired whoever it was that was manager and hired Billy for whatever time it was. And Jackie walked in and said, "You don't want this job anymore, do you?" And he said, "No, I can't cover Billy." So, I mean, it was the absolute worst time to be a Yankee fan and to be a Yankee. Late Don Baylor, used to tell me that George would cost them, they figured George cost them 10 games a year just because he would just blow up the team, big trade, or demote someone or do something stupid during the 80s. And, he finally in 83 decides to fire Billy again and hire Yogi. And Carmen Berra, who never wanted Yogi to manage, really didn't want him to take that job. But he thought he had a good enough team to win, and he really wanted to win that ring and to prove to people that he was smarter than everyone thought he was, because you can't be stupid if you win a World Series. And he took that, and that was the beginning of him smoking again. And that was the beginning of unbelievable tension. And of course, George famously says that he's going to be able to manage the entire second season, which of course was nice since he had a 2-year contract, and it lasted 16 games. And it was Clyde King who fired him in Chicago. And that was how the rift between him and Steinbrenner started. The 14 years that they spent apart, until George finally realized that he needed to apologize to Yogi. And then they became fast friends after that.
Good. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you. Joe Rundy, you've been waiting for quite a while. So, Joe, go ahead.
I was just curious. Have you heard the story I heard on the baseball series back in the 90s? And Bob Costas, I believe, told it that he was talking to someone who'd interviewed Yogi or interviewed Casey Stengel, and asked Stengel why he was so successful in New York. And he said, "I never played a game without my guy." Yeah. Stengel never identified the guy.
Guy was Yogi.
Only one guy who was there.
Guy was Yogi. When I'll tell you what. Okay, so let me elaborate on that. So Elston Howard comes up. Elston Howard is a great player. And Elston Howard comes up in 1955, and he's a starting catcher for half the teams in baseball, if not more. Casey is still catching Yogi 141 games out of 154. Yogi would catch 20 to 22 doubleheaders a season. He would catch back-to-back doubleheaders in August and September. And the writers would ask Stengel, "Why do you catch Yogi so much?" He goes, "When Mr. Berra is behind the plate, we win World Series." And that's the guy.
That's my guy.
That's the guy.
Yeah.
When he called him as assistant manager, that was not just to puff him up. He was the assistant manager on that team. It was Yogi who met with the pitchers before games, not Stengel. Stengel didn't meet with anybody. Stengel didn't talk to anybody on the team but Yogi. I mean, he was famously aloof from his players. The only guy he talked to was Yogi Berra. So he was his guy in an incredibly successful run, something I don't think we'll ever see again in baseball.
Well put. Thank you. Other questions? We're off to a good start.
We only got another minute or two, so maybe.
Oh, shall we? Okay, so we.
Oh, you could have one more question, one or two more questions.
All right, who wants to get the last question? Anybody? Don't be shy, as I say to my math students.
Oh, John, I have a question for you.
Okay, Alan, go ahead.
It comes about by somebody on Facebook mentioned this. Who were the 3 people who called you at one time or another, and you probably pick up the phone, never too sure who it's going to be, but the 3 greatest who sort of surprised you by being at the other end or were talking to you, etc.?
In terms of this book, or just in my career?
General.
I'm sorry?
In general.
In general.
About baseball.
Don Mattingly, one of my absolute favorites, who is just just a terrific guy, and I love talking to Mattingly. So when he gets on the phone, that was special. David Cohen, because Coney is he's great to talk to, but he is unbelievable elusive. I mean, you could call him, you could email him, everybody, his friends, his agent, teammates. Michael K jokes about it on the telecast. You never know whether you're going to get Coney or not, but when you get him, it's great. And then you forget all the trouble that it was. And I'll tell you, one of my favorite people in this book that I talked to, that I was just so happy to hear from, was Carmen Berra's sister Bonnie, who just has become a great friend. And she was just one of the real challenges. My first book started in 1990. In 1990, I am 38 years old. I've been in journalism for 14 years. I know the territory. I got to fill in the blanks on this book from 1925, until, 1960s. And she was just tremendous of filling everything in, unbelievably patient, great memory, and just a really, really special woman. So those are the three people. Those are the three that really stand out. Thanks for the question. That was good.
That we could probably very easily go on and on with the SABR crowd, but thank you very much. And regarding what Carl mentioned, I hope people will try to get a hold of your book. I'd like to do that myself. So
it's been my pleasure, Steve. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Great to have you. So good. Next in the batting order is Erik Sherman, who's written about the Mets and Red Sox. And you likewise have about 20 minutes and then Q&A. So Erik, welcome likewise, and take it away.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to join you all this evening. So I basically started writing professionally at 14 years old, but a college professor at Emerson College in Boston told me that there's nothing older than yesterday's newspaper. You should try to write books. And my father worked in the newspaper business. So on the weekends, I would be in newsrooms and in the archives. And I loved the newspaper business, but I did in fact start to write books, but I never wanted to write books, about just heroics. So all 7 of my books really transcend baseball and take on a human interest aspect. I was the co-author of autobiographies with Glenn Burke, who was the first player to come out and died of AIDS. I was literally working on his book while he sadly was succumbing to AIDS on his deathbed. That book is being made into a movie right now by Jamie Lee Curtis for Amazon Studios. I wrote a book with Steve Blass, who was an all-star pitcher and World Series hero with the Pirates, who inexplicably one day couldn't throw the ball straight anymore. But he reinvented himself and became just a terrific baseball analyst and personality up in the Pirates booth for 33 years. He retired last year. Mookie Wilson was a sharecropper's son who rose above it all to become one of the kings of Queens, which was one of the book, which is a nice segue because that was the next book that I wrote, which was on the entire 86 Mets team, where I traveled around 30,000 miles crisscrossing the country to meet with the 86 Mets roughly 3 decades after their World Series championship over the Red Sox. Davey Johnson loved that book so much. He said, "You're the guy. I want you to write my autobiography with me." So that was my next book. That really led to this book, After the Miracle, The Lasting Brotherhood of the 69 Mets, which I wrote with Art Shamsky, which is really 2 books in one. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about this book and then about a book I have that's going to be released in March Two Sides of Glory, which is a similar book to what I did with the 86 Mets, but I did with the 86 Red Sox, where I met with the key and most intriguing players from that team. But I think it's so appropriate and a little ironic tonight that the two books I'm going to talk about include teams for which Tom Seaver played a pivotal role in both of them. So the first, After the Miracle, The Lasting Brotherhood of the 69 Mets, it's really two books in one. The bookends of the book, the beginning and the end, had to do with the trip that Art Shamsky, who was an outfielder with that team, and we organized. You know, at first, we share the same agent. So we were talking about, well, how do we make a 69 Mets book different from the other 35 that have been written throughout the years? And so we knew the 50th anniversary of the 69 championship was coming up. And he said, you know, we're going to have to go and visit Tom because Tom can no longer travel because he's been struggling so severely with Lyme disease. And so I said, well, I certainly don't have a problem going out to see Tom on his vineyard. And I thought that would be great. But I thought about it and I said to Art, I said, you know what would be really great and what would be an angle which would separate our project from all the others on the 69 Mets, if we got some of his closest friends and teammates from that 69 team and we brought the 50th anniversary celebration to him. So Art and I talked and talked. We're like, well, you know, who should we bring? You know, who might feel slighted by not coming along? But for various reasons, we ended up with Bud Harrelson, who was Tom's roommate on the road for 11 seasons. They were both from California, and Buddy was Tom's best friend on the team. Then there was Jerry Koosman. You know, if there was an ace on that Mets team from, you know, late 67 through 77 when Tom was traded to the Reds, it was clearly Tom, but he was more like a 1A with Koosman being a 1B instead of a number 2. Because Koosman in the big games was incredible. He easily could have been the MVP of the 69 series. He nearly pitched a no-hitter in game 2 against a vaunted Orioles team, one of the greatest teams ever. It's incredible that team really just had the one world championship in 1970, losing in 69 and 71. So we invited Koosman. And then the last one was Rocky Swoboda, which wasn't an obvious choice, but in Tom's only World Series victory that he ever had, it was Swoboda that made that incredible catch to help preserve that game for Tom. You know, the spectacular catch, arguably the greatest catch in World Series history, right there with Willie Mays' catch in 51. You know, it at least kept the game tied. And then, of course, the Mets won in the 10th inning with J.C. Martin's bunt and all that. So we converge on San Francisco Airport. Koosman from Minneapolis, Swoboda from New Orleans, and we took, Art and I took Buddy with us on the flight out there. We converged. We had rented a big van, and we couldn't see Tom the night that we got there, but we were planning on seeing him the next day. And Nancy Seaver had said, you know, you guys are really taking a chance. Tom has good days and bad days. And, you know, if this is the only day that you can see him, because Rocky had to get back to his broadcasting, and there were a number of dynamics at play. There were about 50 things that could have come in the way of us seeing Tom in the months leading up to that trip. But incredibly, everything worked out. Tom was in great spirits, and it was truly the last opportunity for anyone to possibly interview Tom which I was lucky enough to do out on his vineyard. And then the rest of the time I was just a fly on the wall, just observing and chronicling these 69 Mets bantering back and forth and telling old stories. And it was just such a beautiful day. And we went out to lunch after the vineyard, and just to listen to these guys was incredible. And we were in the parking lot afterwards, and nobody wanted to leave because they all knew that this was going to be the last time that they were all going to get together. And when you think about that, you know, you're talking about this group of guys that put together a miracle, which is synonymous with all sports miracles. And this was the last time that Koosman and Seaver and Buddy and Art and Rocky were all going to be together again. And it was, I don't know if bittersweet is the word, but it was melancholy. I mean, these guys that day shared laughs and tears, and it was just very emotional. So those are the cornerstones of the book. And then in the middle, we interviewed every living person from that 69 Mets team. We interviewed grounds crew. We interviewed Joan Hodges. We interviewed writers. Anybody that was around then, we interviewed them. And I mean, I could have written a book just on our meeting with Ed Charles, which happened to be the last interview that he ever did also before he passed. So it's a book that really, I think, captures the soul of that 69 Mets team like none other. And so it was a surreal experience for me. I've interviewed hundreds of athletes, but you know, to be in that van with Koosman riding shotgun and having Buddy and Art and Rocky in the back, driving to see Tom Seaver at the top of a hill at his house and vineyard was just surreal. So it was a great experience, and one that I'll certainly never forget. And so while that trip was taking place, I was in the midst of writing this book on the '86 Red Sox, Two Sides of Glory, which will be coming out in March. And I've written 4 Mets-related books, and Kings of Queens, Mets fans loved it. You know, I've received so much feedback because it got so personal. You know, I've had guys like Gooden and Strawberry, you know, break down in tears during our talks. And it was like that with the '86 Red Sox too. You know, with Bruce Hurst breaking down 3 times during our talk. With Bill Buckner, the last interview with him, by the way, him telling me that his family, you know, had never gotten over the abuse that they had to live through from fans, the cruelty, teachers, coaches of their kids, and what they would say. And so, despite Buckner's persona of telling people, well, I got over it, it's fine, he never did, not until the end. And but he was such a courageous man. Clemens opened up about you know, the steroid allegations with me more than, for whatever reason, more than anybody else. And then there was Seaver, who, when I was at his vineyard, I talked to him about the '86 Red Sox, but then I also talked to guys like Joe Sambito, Roger Clemens, Bruce Hurst, Marty Barrett, about how Seaver, coming over to that team, his last year in the major leagues, clearly not the pitcher that he was, but he was so brilliant. The art of pitching and the influence that he had on the Hursts and the Seaver, the Hurst and the Clemens, you can't quantify it. And so he helped them in ways other than his pitching. But the influence that he had on these guys really helped them win the pennant. And as everyone knows, one strike away from winning the championship. Wade Boggs going on about the science of hitting like no one else. Jim Rice, a tough interview, but I would expect nothing less. And that's what made it great. And, there's just, they were all so different. And that's what I love about doing these in-depth interviews with players from these iconic teams, because they're so different. They come from different worlds, different experiences. Oil Can Boyd, you can only imagine how he would go from speaking so intelligently and then in the same sentence kind of going back to where he came from in Mississippi, from the ghetto. And it's just thrilling. There's new history being told, and you're uncovering new details about some of those old stories. So that's the thrill that I get out of it. I get much more thrill out of the creation of a book than I do really with anything else. So I've been lucky to have experienced the experiences that I've had with guys I grew up watching, and one of these days I'll do a book on a current player or a current team, but it just seems like I've been stuck in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But it's been a lot of fun. So I think my time's about up. So if we want to open up to some questions, that would be great.
Thanks, Erik. I appreciate hearing about that. So let's get some discussion going. So raise your hand, please, if you'd like to ask something. I see Alan, and then we'll keep this going. Alan, go ahead, please.
Erik, nice seeing you again.
Me too.
A few years ago in my own research, one of the calls that was great to hear on the other end was from Davy Johnson. And Davy, at the end of our discussion, said, "Do you know any writers? Because I have another book in me." I met you maybe within a year after that interview. And of course, then the Kings of Queens were out. And I did hear that you two were collaborating. And I believe I emailed both of you that it was just a great choice. And I would recommend to anyone reading the Davy Johnson book, especially the last few chapters. I won't give away anything, but that was definitely written from the heart and a wonderful book to read. I'll say that. And that's where I'll leave off with this. Could you talk a little bit about Davy?
Yeah, Davy, John was talking about how Yogi was an underrated baseball player. Davy is an underrated baseball man. No one promoted the game across more countries and audiences than Davy. I mean, he really, I like to say he was the Forrest Gump of baseball. He was on Double Deck the night that Hank Aaron broke Babe Ruth's record. He was on Double Deck the night that Sadahara in Japan of the Giants, the Tokyo Giants, surpassed Babe Ruth. He got the last hit off Sandy Koufax. He really brought sabermetrics into baseball well before Billy Beane or anybody else that gets credit for it. Davy brought sabermetrics into baseball in 1968 when he wanted to hit second in the Orioles lineup. He called it the Orioles offense optimization or something like that. And And he proved to Earl Weaver that the Orioles would score an extra 95 or so runs with him hitting second. So on a personal level, you know, Davey, he's super intelligent. Like, I like to tell people that you haven't truly watched a baseball game until you've watched one with someone like Davey. And I don't think he gets enough credit for that. Every team he went to, he instantly made better. He was a lot like Billy Martin, you know, without all the fights. Although Davey got into a few for sure, but not like Billy. And, you know, with that Mets team, from 84 through 88, had they had the wild card, they would have made the playoffs every single year. But Davey, you know, he's a complicated guy. We worked extremely well together, but I know that there are a lot of people in baseball that he feels kind of took credit for, you know, the jobs that he would do. And he believes that in a few of those cases, like in Baltimore, in New York, certainly, that he deserved more credit for some of the things that he did in Cincinnati, and to a lesser degree in LA. It just seemed like he always ended up playing for people or managing under people that could be difficult, you know, like Marge Schott, Peter Angelos, Rupert Murdoch. And in New York, you know, it wasn't easy with Frank Cashin, especially when Frank brought on a couple of assistant GMs and took some of the power away from Davey. Davey never wanted to see Kevin Mitchell or Ray Knight leave, especially Kevin Mitchell. Roger McDowell and Lenny Dykstra, all those decisions were made without Davey's input. So I think there's some regret there. But by and large, I mean, he had a wonderful baseball life.
Thank you. Good summary. Ray, I see your hand, and let's keep this going.
Yeah. Are you able to just talk about, of course, Tom Seaver in 1977, he gets traded to Cincinnati. After 5.5 years, he comes back to the Mets, has a year, and then he's left off, I guess, the protected list, and the White Sox pick him up the following year. Can you talk a little bit about the Mets' thoughts there? And did they, I guess they didn't expect to see him taken, but anything more about that whole process?
Well, I'll revert back to someone that was there. Davey Johnson was hired after the 83 season. I want to say November of 83. So he still would have had Tom Seaver. And Davey told me he was always very suspicious of that. You know, the Mets were loaded with young pitchers, and Seaver wasn't coming cheap at that point. And, you know, the Mets have always been tight with the buck. You know, this was a team that never signed free agents in the 80s. And Davey always felt that was very suspicious that they wouldn't protect him. But they had guys like Sid Fernandez and Ron Darling, and of course, Dwight Gooden and Roger McDowell, they were going to use in the bullpen. But, you know, they had this stable of young pitchers coming up who no doubt Seaver could have helped, but he also would have taken a spot in the rotation. So I'm not so sure that the front office, from what I heard, was all that upset that actually happened.
Well, he didn't have a particularly good year. He was under 500 in terms of wins and losses, and his ERA was in the mid-3s. So he wasn't I'll say a great I shouldn't say prospect, but great person. But I think, as you mentioned a moment ago, he might still have been able to impart some of his knowledge and his capabilities to some of the younger pitchers and ease them along too.
Absolutely. You know, he could have been to the 84 Mets what Seaver was with the 86 Red Sox with those young pitchers.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
Good question. All right, so who's next? Speak up, don't be shy. Might have to give you a math problem here.
John, okay.
John, go ahead.
Okay, so I got to know how it went with Jim Rice, and I'll tell one quick story for the people there from the Hartford Courant or read the Courant. I get a phone call, I believe it was in 1986, and from a reporter who says, "What are you going to do about Jim Rice?" I said, "What do you mean, what am I going to do about Jim Rice?" He said, "You didn't hear?" I said, "No." He goes, "He had a fight with Steve Fainrue, who was the Hartford Courant's Red
That's
Sox
right.
beat writer."
That's in my book. Yep.
Okay, and so Steve, who is very intense, he's in the locker room. They're on the West Coast, which is where Steve's from, and I believe it was the West Coast.
Yep.
And
Oakland.
Yes, and right, and he's standing there, and Rice comes over, and Rice was not, that '86 team was not an easy team to cover, and Rice was about one of the, if not worst, guys on the team to cover. And Rice says, "Get the fuck out of the locker room." And Steve starts walking out the locker room, stops and says, "What the hell am I doing this for?" And turns around and walks back in. And Rice sees him and says, "I thought I told you to get the hell out of the locker room." And he pushes Steve, grabs him by the back of the shirt, rips his shirt off. Now, for anyone who doesn't know Steve, Steve's about 5'9", 100, and at this time, about 150 pounds. And he goes after Jim Rice. Thankfully, Don Baylor jumps between them and grabs Steve and saves his life. And I then have to talk to Red Sox management about one of your players attacking one of my writers. But tell me how it went with Rice, because he was about as difficult as they came to deal with.
Yeah, I was actually in Boston from '84 through '88. At Emerson College, and I worked at WNEV, the CBS affiliate. I worked for Brookline Cable, and I worked at the radio. So I was around that Red Sox team a lot. And, he's basically the opposite of Wade Boggs, who will talk as long as you want.
Right.
He was great then, and he's great now. And so within a day of each other, so it's the same game plan, John. So I'm either driving or flying or taking trains. So I see Boggs the one day, and then the next, so he's in Tampa. So then I'm driving to Red Sox spring training in Winter Haven. And I'm like, it's just such a mellow day. It's early spring training. Everyone's just so cool. And you have Louis Tion riding around in the golf cart. You have Rick Porcello, warming up on one field. You have Rich Gedman with some young players on another field. And it's just such a perfect day. And I'm like really not nervous, but just like uneasy, because you really have to watch what you say. So we start talking. He was having his knee work done. He was in some pain, and I'm like, this is great. But before I got there, one of the media up in Boston said, "Oh, Jim, you're going to talk to Erik Sherman. Oh, he's a great writer." And I don't know why this guy said that, because I had only met him once, but he had read a book or whatever. And he says, "Yeah, he's a great guy." And so Rice, though, he's stone-faced. And so he says, "I'll tell you what, I gotta get my knee work done. I'll meet you back here at noon." So he comes out like around, I don't know, close to 1. It's fine. And, but before he left, I said to him, before he left to have his knee work done, I don't know why I thought of this, but I said, "Jim, by the way, I know you're from South Carolina. My mother retired to Clemson, South Carolina. She lives in a town called Salem, South Carolina. So it's about 30 minutes from Clemson University." And he goes, "Salem? Salem. I've never heard of Salem. And it's literally 40 minutes from where he grew up. And I knew that. And he says, Salem. And he starts laughing. He's like, I can't, it's like, I'm going to have to look that one up. And all of a sudden, this isn't really funny. I mean, it's more curious than anything else. But he thought that was hysterical. So I'm like, this is great. I have broken the ice with Jim Rice. When he comes out to talk to me later, this is going to be a piece of cake. He comes out. It was like he had never met me before. And so I had my questions ready. But I don't know what it was, but he wasn't great about answering my questions directly. He wanted to play games like compare the 75 Red Sox with the 2004 and 2007 Red Sox. And he says, everyone says that Manny Ramirez was better than I was. No way, and so that's kind of how it went, which isn't bad. When you go off.
Not bad for Jim.
Yeah. I mean, the craziest interview I ever had was in Kings of Queens with Lenny Dykstra. Where I spent like a few hours with him, and my questions weren't worth the paper they were printed on. I mean, but that was a roller coaster of an interview, and it was a lot of fun. And that's, people talk about that chapter as much as the Doc Gooden or Doug Sisk or Ed Hearn or Darryl Strawberry chapters. It's so Rice. It is what it is, but yeah, I was a little bit apprehensive about it, but you've got to get him. I mean, he's a Hall of Famer. He was in the MVP conversation that year, and
he was a tremendous player. I mean, no question. He was just, that whole team was very, very difficult to deal with. McNamara was not an easy manager.
No.
Clemens was not an easy person. Never has been an easy person. The whole team, but Rice was. He batted cleanup on the all difficult team and there. And
I think they've changed, because I'm just going through my head now. Clemens could not have been more accommodating. We talked.
Yeah, I got Roger too, and once you get Roger going, he's great.
Yeah,
I mean, he was terrific. But not when they were playing. Not that year. They hated the press. And I think they had an adversarial relationship with Dan Shaughnessy and the Globe, and that played. I mean, the Globe and the Herald coverage is just a major part of being in that town and being with the Red Sox. And they fought all the time, and it just affected everybody. I mean, I remember when they went up in that World Series. I was in Fenway. They go up 3-2. They're going back to Shea, and you would have thought, and they were being interviewed. It was Rice, Clemens, and McNamara. And you would have thought that they would have been on cloud 9. They were so nasty, in the interview room. The three of them was so nasty, was so bitter in their answers to the press. It's like, what? I mean, I dealt with these people all year, so I wasn't surprised. It's like, wow, this should be the happiest moment of your life.
Yeah. And
you are treating it like, we're at a funeral and we've just insulted everyone in your family. And that's so, hey, anything you got from Jim Rice is a plus,
Yeah. Yeah, no. And the one guy that I was most surprised talked to me, invited me into his home in Austin, Texas, was Calvin Schiraldi, who was terrific.
Yeah. Another guy, yeah.
They were all great. I mean, Hearst wanted nothing to do with an interview. He hadn't done an interview in 4 years. But funny story, Marty Barrett gave me his number and said, "Oh, Bruce will talk to you." And,
how'd you get this number?
Well,
that's always great when you hear that.
He thought I was somebody else. The numbers got crossed. So he was in a great mood when he picked up the phone. He was like, thought it was a friend of his. Bizarre. I don't know how this happens. And it took me about 25 minutes. And then he finally said to me, well, if you're going to fly all the way out to Phoenix to see me, I'll give you as much time as you need. But he had a hard time. I mean, he could not have been nicer. He was, he came dressed up to the interview at the hotel, and
Yeah.
but the poor guy, broke down 3 times. I mean, these are men in their 60s now,
Yeah. Right.
and they're still struggling with the outcome of that series, and also about the effect, like Bruce would talk about the effects of leaving the game and being an old man for baseball, but a young man for the real world. And that's really tough.
Yes.
On almost all these guys, as you know. And it hits some harder than others. And Bruce said to me, yeah, I wish I was never a ball player. I wish I had done something else. Can you imagine? This was a guy that was 3 innings away from being an immortal, like 3 World Series games. And he wishes that he never, Gedman, the same thing. He says,
right.
I wish 86 never happened.
Yeah.
So it's, these guys, after all this time, they open up. And I think where you were at with your staff in Hartford covering that team, maybe it's the 30 years of retrospection, that they look at things differently, and they're more open to talking about it. And I always find that it's therapeutic for them.
Yeah, I agree. When you finally get them to go, you feel like you're a psychiatrist.
Oh yeah, psychiatrist, clergy. That's how it felt.
No, there's no question that happens. I mean, you feel like, geez, I could be charging about $200 of 45 minutes here. Not the $1.50 an hour that we make with all the time that we put into the books.
Yeah. I mean, Davy Johnson was exhausted when we finished that book.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he lost his daughter to the effects of schizophrenia. He lost a deaf and blind stepson to pneumonia.
That's the interesting thing. I always used to tell my reporters this, and by the way, you guys can stop us from talking if you want,
Yeah.
but that these are real people. They're not baseball cards. They have real lives. And, remember that when you're covering them, because it's hard, and it's, look, I would have loved to have been a baseball player. I don't think I would have regretted being a baseball player. I thought I was going to be a baseball player, but it ain't easy. It's not easy being in that limelight, the pressure that's on these guys, the way that people think about them and drool over them and lavish them and criticize them. I mean, it's a strange life.
It
really
is. And I would just finish, the Red Sox book by saying to what you brought up about their personal lives. I mean, Dwight Evans with 2 sons who were suffering from elephant man's disease while he was playing all those years. And in fact, Dwight and I had to postpone our interview for about 5 months because the older son, he was at stage 4. And in the time that I met Dwight to now, both of his sons have passed away.
Right.
And John McNamara, losing his.
That was tough. And he had a kid, what he was going through that season was really, really hard.
Yeah. So there's just so many of these stories, and we could go on and on. But I know we're up against time, but I just encourage you, not because I had anything to do with After the Miracle or Two Sides of Glory, but, just get these books for the stories. There's such an important fabric of baseball history, and you really get to know these guys on such a personal level.
Yeah, congratulations. They are good books.
To you too, John. Thank you.
Ray, go ahead.
Yeah. Did you ever either of you interview Bill Lee, the spaceman?
Did not get him. What about you?
I would have loved to. I met Bill, and he's one of my favorite people, and he's so eloquent and interesting. And of course, he was a great pitcher with the Red Sox in the mid '70s, especially. But I haven't had a subject matter which would have invited me to interview him. If I ever do a book on the '75 Red Sox, maybe,
Okay.
or on marijuana in baseball, maybe. Yeah, I'd love to do something that would include him for sure. It's not in the plans, but he's one of my favorite baseball people.
I wanted to jump in and ask a question. I guess we got to wrap it up soon, but if maybe, Erik, if you could comment, please. I'd like to take this in a different direction. And there's still Alan and Paul, so we'll get to that. If you could comment, please, on thinking about the dynamics of the '69 Mets and '86 Red Sox. I'm wondering if you, maybe both of you, could comment about what are the dynamics that make for a championship team? I mean, beyond the skills and the stats of it, in terms of personalities, how it gelled. And I remember in '69 when someone like Al Weiss came out of nowhere to hit a big home run, for instance. And some of you who follow other teams might have similar reminiscences. So I'm wondering, what was it about those kinds of teams, maybe especially the '69 Mets, who seemingly came out of nowhere and really never again approached that level of excellence until really '86?
Well, I mean, there was a tremendous difference between the '69 Mets and the '86 Mets. And it started right at the top with the managers. I think no two Mets teams personified the personalities of their managers like those two teams. Gil Hodges was exactly what that young Mets team needed. He's a former Marine. He fought in World War II and some major battles. And so, I mean, those guys were literally afraid of him. So he could do whatever he wanted, which included platooning at up to 5 positions if you include catcher. And back in those days, that didn't happen a lot. And players didn't like it because at salary time, it hurt them.
Really hurt, yeah.
But Gil was able to do it because they won. They were winning with that formula. And, they had these young pitchers coming up at the same time, much like that mid-'80s Mets team did, the same thing, only with the '86 Mets manager, Davey was a player's manager. And the only thing that he expected was for his players to show up on time and be ready to play. What they did at 3 o'clock in the morning, he could care less about.
And they were doing things at 3 o'clock in the morning.
And Davey was too.
Yes.
And so, but Davey wasn't afraid to fine a guy if there was a pop-up to short right field, the ball drops in and you're still on first base. He called it the strawberry rule. So you would get fined if you weren't hustling and being where you were supposed to be, and if you made mental mistakes. So that's how Davey managed. Gil, it was more with almost fear. I mean, even Seaver feared him.
Yeah.
And, Seaver was a Marine too. But he just had so much respect from those guys. And so I think when you ask, what made those teams great, I think those teams addressed their greatest needs. The '86 Mets, they needed a guy like Tuffle to hit from the right side because Backman wasn't that great against lefties. They needed a veteran left-handed pitcher. They went out and got Bobby Ojeda. And the year before, they got Gary Carter. And with the '69 Mets, it was just all this pitching. And they just needed that one big bat, which they got after the season started in Don Clendenin. But the managers of those two teams played a big role. So that's the long-winded answer.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think chemistry is such a big part of it. And I mean, you're together. Baseball, I mean, I've hired for every sport. I've managed people in every sport as beat writers. Baseball is completely different because you're with these guys from February until late October, every single day. And you really have to know how to manage people. And you look at the Yankees with that run. Joe Torre was, the biggest part of being a Yankee manager was keeping George Steinbrenner away from the players.
Yeah.
And he figured out how to do it. There were some rumors that Steinbrenner was a little worried that Torre had mob connections, and that's why he didn't move on Torre. I don't know that that was true or false. I kept hearing it, but so I don't think that was the case. Torre, I think, knew how to manage Steinbrenner, and that was a Hall of Fame job, just managing George Steinbrenner, because the team doesn't win unless you keep George away from the players. And, he just set up an environment to let them win. And like you were saying about platooning, that 96 team, the Yankees had, Cecil Fielder on the bench, and he benched Paul O'Neill, Tino Martinez, and one other player, I can't remember. Oh, Wade Boggs in the last game and played three other guys, Cecil Fielder and Charlie Hayes and whoever the last person was in the outfield. And he was able to do that because they trusted him and they really appreciated him giving them the space between Steinbrenner. And the huge person that he leaned on really big was David Cohen. You got a guy like David Cohen on your team, it doesn't matter if you went 4-11. He was just such a perfect person in that locker room all season that he was worth keeping on the team just to help manage the team.
Thank you. I think I see Mark Wise, and I think, Paul, did you want to?
Yeah, I have a quick comment for Erik, because the time frame that you've been writing about here, mentioning the Mets in the 1980s, I know this is a bit of a plug, but published just last week, David Krell edited the New York Mets in Popular Culture. This piggybacks on the Yankee edition that he did last year. I contributed a chapter on the swagger that the Mets developed in the 1980s, not least of which included the copious use of illicit drugs. Just by complete sheer coincidence, I stayed a place up in Cooperstown called the Inn of Cooperstown, and the innkeeper, Mark, is not too attuned with sports, and he just happens to mention that he's very good personal friends with Dr. Alan Lands, and I'm sure, Erik, you know who that is. And really, he doesn't know. He says about the only recognizable ball player to me would be somebody like Babe Ruth. That anybody that played on the Mets at that time was just completely lost on him. And I says to Mark, I said, "You're kidding." I said, "Could you introduce me by email, because I'm writing about this subject?" And I actually hooked up with Dr. Lands, and he gave some very interesting explanations about what was going on with the chemistry, no pun intended,
Right.
the chemistry that's going on with the Mets at that time. And just a quick example, he mentions that the Mets filled the need by bringing in Gary Carter in 1985, but at the same time, you're also introducing that competitive element that he wants to lead the team as a captain, and Keith Hernandez also wants to lead the team, and you're butting heads here in that particular instance. So that was something. And again, I just wanted to jump in about, because this book literally just came out last week, so you might be interested in it. And our good friend Bill Reisick contributed the chapter on Casey Stengel also.
Good.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, Paul. We'll hear more from Paul later. Mark, as you get the last question, and then we've got to move on.
Yeah, I had a question for Erik.
Yeah.
In your book about the '86 Red Sox, was there any talk about any decision making in the seventh game when Hurst started running out of gas, the failure to use Oil Can Boyd or Roger Clemens in relief? That always was mind-boggling to me as the series is slipping away again.
Absolutely. So Clemens told, oh man, where to begin? I mean, Clemens, and this is going to be in the book, he's like, I could have gotten an inning or two in Game 7. And of course, he never wanted to be taken out of Game 6. He had developed a blister. So there was a little bit of blood on the ball, but only when he would throw breaking pitches. So he said to me that 3 of the 4 hits he had given up that night were on breaking balls. So he could have just gone with fastballs the rest of the way, and then maybe like a baby slider or something like that. But he had his batting helmet on, ready to hit in the 8th inning, and McNamara called him back, and the Mets, of course, would tie it up against Schiraldi, and then go on to win. But yeah, Oil Can Boyd, he was in no condition to pitch in Game 7, according to one of the trainers. But Oil Can told me that he could have pitched because really what they had in the bullpen, Sambito was okay. Schiraldi had been dominant in the second half of the regular season, but it really struggled in the postseason a little bit against the Angels. He blew that game that Clemens had started that they should have won. And then, of course, game 6. But still, he was capable. But the Mets had so much confidence against Schiraldi because Schiraldi was a Met. They all grew up in the farm system with him, and they knew that he didn't possess the swagger that a reliever often has, because he wasn't a reliever. He was a starter. So, he had terrific stuff. In fact, you had scouts when both Clemens and Schiraldi were at the University of Texas that actually ranked Schiraldi higher than Clemens. But it was a terribly mismanaged Game 6 and 7 on McNamara's part. This is a team that had a 3-run lead, and Hurst gave all that he had, so you really can't fault him at all. It was a 3-3 game, but that Red Sox bullpen, it was dreadful.
I always wondered if McNamara was a better communicator. Understandably, Oil Can Boyd expects to pitch Game 7, but the day of rain happened, and understandably, it's the one good decision Hurst he made, putting Hurst in Game 7. But if McNamara, I figure, was a better manager, there could have been some better communication between him and Boyd saying, look, you're not starting this game, but you might be on the hill to finish this.
Right.
But it seemed like you have McNamara saying that he's in no shape to pitch, and you have Boyd saying, I could have pitched. Maybe it was handled differently, perhaps. I don't know.
What Oil Can told me was the trainer told McNamara that he was in no condition to pitch because Oil Can, after finding out that he wasn't going to pitch Game 7 because of the rain out, he took a taxi to Harlem and bought some crack. But Oil Can said, but I did that all the time. So
what the heck?
I would have been fine, to have pitched a couple of innings. But to me, why Clemens wasn't available, and he was available, and why he wasn't used. You see it all the time, even today with these pitchers that are babied like they are, and that only go 5 or 6 innings to start games. Once October rolls around, your ace pitchers are pitching, 3 games in a 7-game series. They're coming out of the bullpen.
It happened last year, right? Garrett Cole was sitting in the bullpen. The manager and pitcher was waiting for the lead. That never happened in Game 7, right?
Right. So, the idea that Clemens couldn't have pitched, especially with that rain out, to give them like a couple of innings. The one thing that I bring up in the SABR chapter and quote some guys, and in fact, Peter Gammons, he gave a nice blurb for the book. Peter told me that he believes that if Seaver were healthy, that he contends that the Red Sox win that World Series because they would have probably pitched Seaver in Game 3. That was the Nipper game, I believe, right?
Game 4.
Game 4
was Nipper, yeah.
Game 4 was Nipper, who he had a dreadful year. He pitched to an ERA of like 5.6. And if they had Seaver, to come out of the bullpen, think about the drama that would have brought. Seaver at Shea in Game 7, coming out. You wouldn't even watch it if it were a Hollywood film because it's just, it would be as bad as that awful John Goodman Babe Ruth movie. It just would have been just too much. But that could have happened, and I would love to have seen that. That would have been incredible.
And on that note, we need to start to wrap this up, but this has really been very, very good. So thank you, Erik, as well as Jon. We're going
My
to
pleasure.
wrap up with a couple of short announcements. Alan Cohen first, and then Paul Hensler second, and then we have to evidently, unfortunately, bring this to a close. Alan, go ahead, please.
Okay. Just want to mention a couple of things about SABR books and then our project. Our most recent book that's out is on blowouts, basically about a whole bunch of one-sided games like 19-3, etc., available through SABR. Our next books coming out are on Griffith Stadium in Washington, some great games. I imagine there'll be some Yankee game from 1953 in there. I think Steve might remember that one. Then we have a book on great comebacks, a book on one-hit wonders, guys who only had one hit in their major league career. We are talking about some obscure people here. A book on the 1942 Kansas City Monarchs, a book on Jackie Robinson, games that he played in, and a book on Shibe Park in Philadelphia. But what I really want to talk about is our First Games Back project. Towards the beginning of all of this pandemic, back in April, I got to thinking about games that were held after a hiatus in play. And I went to Bill Nowlin, who's our book guru, and we decided to push forward with this thing. So between April 8th and May 31st, we got 61 stories in, and from close to 50 authors, and it's now out as a SABR project. If you go to our new website, and I encourage you to do so, and you go into the tab up left, which says search the research collection, and you've put in First Games Back project, it'll take you to a screen, and then you go to the First Games Back page, and we have a number of games on any given day. They rotate them. You can see those games. There's a brief introduction, and down at the bottom, if you click for the games, the list of games, we have 62 games out there now. We added a game that Paul Hensler had written up, the First Game Back in Seattle. His focus was on the Angels for that story, but he did note the historical significance of going back to Seattle. I personally wrote about games after 9/11. And I must admit, that was probably a tough article to write on the first game back at Yankee Stadium, which was September 25th of 2001. Roger Clemens pitched that game. He was trying to set the all-time consecutive game win streak by a pitcher if he had won that game, but he did not win the game. Ironically, the Yankees clinched their division that night because the second place team lost. So it was one of those games, although they lost, they clinched the division. Clemens earlier that day had gone to Fire Engine House 22. Again, irony, because that was his uniform number. So it was a great story. We have stories in this project going all the way back to 1871, and we take it through 2019. Mark Cantor wrote a story for the book on, I think it was the first Phillies game ever. And so it was we have, I think, 4 or 5 Bob Davis Awards winners in there. John Thorne, the official historian of Major League Baseball. Tom Hufford, a founder of SABR. It was just spectacular. We had great contributions from our fact checker, Carl Reichers. Carl is just simply the best fact checker we have. There's nobody else. And we had Len Levin as our copy editor again. Len's just marvelous. And I'll leave it at that because I'm running out of throat and we're running out of time. Steve?
Thank you, Alan. Good summary. Last but not least is Paul Handler, who's got a couple of projects in the pipeline. So, Paul, you're like the closer. So let's hear from you. You need to unmute yourself, Paul. Paul, you're on. You need to unmute yourself.
Tom, can you unmute him?
No. His lips are moving.
Paul, please unmute yourself so we can hear you.
A lower left-hand corner.
Okay.
There he is.
Okay, yeah, I got that host, only the host can unmute the participants. That pop-up finally came up. Just very quickly, I met with the board a couple weeks ago, and our chapter board was very kind in sanctioning my high school project, but that's become a solo effort for me. But just a quick update on that. I'm moving ahead with that. About 10 days ago, I was feeling like, geez, anybody going to talk to me about this? I don't know how the project is going to move forward. And since last Thursday, I've talked to several players. This is with regard to the famous Naugatuck High School 64-game winning streak from 1970 to 1972. So it's not within the usual scope of SABR as Major League Baseball, even minor league baseball, but it's something near and dear to me because I saw a lot of those guys play. And it is moving along pretty well. Many miles to go on it, but I just want to give everybody an update again, express my appreciation for the board and the support that they gave me when I first broached them about helping out with this. The big news for me, and this is on the major league level, I received word from Roman and Littlefield that my proof pages for my next book will be coming to me in about 4 weeks. The title of the book is Gathering Crowds, Catching Baseball Fever in the Early Era of Free Agency. And I wish John and Erik had hung on the line for just a little bit more because I'm sure some of these topics would be very familiar to them. I had to put some of the material on the cutting room floor because I was way over budget on my word count. But I was very happy to do that because it occupied my time during the COVID episode here. So I did have to drop 33,000 words to get it down to their acceptable level. But nonetheless, 9 chapters encompassing everything from, of course, labor issues, money issues. I have a chapter called The Tale of Three Commissioners because during this time we have the run out of Bowie Kuhn's term, the entering of Peter Uberoth, and then the quick, very unfortunate passing of Bart Giamatti. I devote an entire chapter to drugs in this particular instance because it's the 1980s. I don't get into steroids too much. A little bit toward the end of that chapter I do, but mainly talking about the cocaine scandals that infected the game in the 1980s. I devote a chapter called Take Me Out to the Newer Ballpark because we also have a run out of what we think of as the plastic stadiums with concrete and AstroTurf and plastic seats and whatnot. We have the run out of that with the Metrodome in Minneapolis and also Sky Dome up in Toronto. But I also give space to Janet Marie Smith because at the end of the 1980s, the drawing board is what becomes Oriole Park at Camden Yards, that she's in the process of designing that at the end of the 1980s. So that was fair game. I devote a chapter to expansion, rumors of expansion, a lot of ownership changes taking place in this particular time frame. I devote a whole chapter to 3 Hall of Fame team architects, as I would term them, Pat Gillick, John Schuerholz, And he also gives some space to Whitey Herzog, even though he's better known as a manager. But nonetheless, he was very instrumental in formulating the Cardinals teams in the 1980s with that hit and run style. And you probably heard my grandmother's clock in my office just went off, so sorry about that. And Tom Zachary will be happy to hear. Also within that chapter, I couldn't ignore Al Campanis, despite the opprobrium that he brought on himself in 1987 with that dreadful Nightline interview. But nonetheless, he was an architect at this time and formulating the great teams of the Dodgers that they carried through not just the 1970s, but also through the 1980s as well. I devote a whole chapter on the marketing of the game. We see really an explosion of marketing opportunities. Again, a lot of this has to do with Peter Ueberroth, but the licensing of major league trademarks and such, and all manner of household products and apparel, anything you could think of that they could stick a major league logo onto. This came into being in the 1980s as well. And finally, I devote one chapter to societal issues. And I think Erik and Jon may have mentioned something to the effect about there's a movie in the works about the life of Glenn Burke. In my societal chapters, I deal about gays in baseball. Of course, we have Dave Pallone, the umpire. The brash attitudes were being expressed, very emblematic of the 1980s. There's still racial issues infecting the game, and women, the influence that they had on the game as well. I have a wonderful quote from Claire Smith that she just happened to very innocently put on Facebook, and I got a hold of her. I said, would you mind if I use that in the book? So I'm not going to spoil the surprise. They have to buy the book to read her quote, but she really had a wonderful, wonderful way of putting into context women in the locker room. And this is beyond the unfortunate incident that she was exposed to in 1984 during the National League Championship Series. It's much more pleasant than that, but nonetheless, all this many societal issues are tied together at this time. So it's a pretty interesting book. It checks in at somewhere around 120,000 words. I don't know what the proof pages are going to look like, but this is on schedule. Roman has done a nice job in handling this for me, and their expected publication will be just a little bit after Erik's book next year. So we're looking for a time frame of next April for the release of Gathering Crowds, Catching Baseball Fever in the Early Era of Free Agency. So that's my update. Thanks, Steve, for your time.
Thank you, Paul, and thanks everybody. Any announcements or anybody have anything to bring up before we call it a night? And any scores updates? Well, if not, then thanks to Tom for the technology, and Carl, Allen, and Stan. And thank you all. And if you like this, we'll do it again.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was good.
If any of you want to speak, let us know about that. Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Good night.
Thanks,
Good
Steve.
night. Take care.
Good meeting.
Yes, thank you all. Good luck to the Phillies, Mark.